Welcome back to Conversations Different, a weekly podcast of the Santa Fe New Mexican focusing on the interesting issues and people of northern New Mexico. And in these dry and increasingly hotter times, no issue is more important and interesting than how we use our precious water. This is your host, Inez Russell Gomez, and today I am talking to Denise Fort, emeritus professor of law at the University of New Mexico and longtime Western water policy expert. She is spending her post-employment years working on climate change, environmental flows, and other environmental issues. Welcome, Denise.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Let us start out with a definition and tell me what an environmental flow is.
Well, environmental flows refers to keeping water in rivers, which shouldn't be an odd idea, but in New Mexico, we don't have any legal protection that would require that water be kept in rivers. The only time there's legal protection is if there's an endangered species. And so through the federal endangered species law, we've got a requirement that the state keeps some minimum flows in some rivers.
That's right. Save the southwestern willow flycatcher.
Yes. Yeah, and the silvery minnow.
That's right. That's right. So if this were instituted in New Mexico, that would mean when the Rio Grande dries up like it does almost every year now, south of Albuquerque, that would not be allowed. Is that?
Well, then the next step is how do we do it in a state where we've already over-appropriated our flows and we have groundwater mining occurring, meaning that groundwater depletions may be further affecting rivers, and we have climate change. And so we're looking at projections perhaps of about and warming, which means that less water reaches
It's all going to
rivers.
Evaporate.
Yeah. So given these factors, the question now is how do we start getting water back into rivers? And it's going to be difficult for the state. We do have something called the Strategic Water Reserve, and that allows the state to purchase water and to put that water, purchase or lease water, to put it in rivers. The state is just about doing a big lease with the Hickory Apache for some San Juan Chama water. So one hopes that'll move down and move as far south as is possible. But it's a really big task, and just to say more, we don't do the right things. We don't have any agency that's charged with protecting rivers in that way. We protect water quality. We have agencies that manage water once it's out of rivers, but we don't have any agency, or there's no charge to any agency to protect we call it ecological integrity, protect the river itself.
So this reminds me of what Santa Fe passed when David Koss was the mayor, which is the Santa Fe Living River Ordinance,
Yes.
which means that at least it has to keep flowing a certain amount. And then a couple of times a year, they have releases from the reservoir up above. Is that sort of similar?
Yes, it is. It's a notion of dedicate. There's some complaints that could be made about how that is operating, but yeah, it's a notion that you set aside. You say, we want there to be water in our rivers. We now have the question with 2 Mile Pond. Can we find 5 or 6 acre feet of water? And it might be the case that the state engineer's office has said, no, you actually don't need any new appropriation. You've got the water. So, we've got the question there. We have the question of whether discharges from the wastewater treatment plant need to continue at any given amount. But yes, Mayor Koss did a wonderful thing and expressed and he was a biologist, by the way, in his early training.
Well, that makes sense. He understood it because what this does, it says a river has a reason to exist apart from the use we can make of the water.
Exactly. We don't just look at it as a resource, which is, so much our language.
Do you have any idea why New Mexico, which has really done some great things environmentally, is the only Western state, I think that's what you said, that doesn't have this protection?
Well, you're asking me about my history. When I started, I was the head of what was called then the Environmental Improvement Division, and Governor Anaya supported in-stream flows, and we put a bill together and brought it to the legislature. And Steve Reynolds, who was famous or infamous as our state engineer at the time, and for many, many years, stood in the back of the room and did thumbs down. And I think we got 1 vote out of that committee, and that was the end of that bill that year. It's been tried over a number of years to bring it back, and basically the state engineer's office has opposed it agricultural interests and I should add that the state engineer's office is really undergoing some good changes. Agricultural interests have opposed it, I think maybe not understanding the benefits that it would bring to downstream users. One former state engineer said to me, if people are dumb enough to put water in the river, then we'll take it. And that seems like a much more logical way to view it.
Well, it makes me think, going to some of the challenges. I mean, one of the big challenges New Mexico is facing is that there's a lawsuit against us by the state of Texas, which says we've been stealing their water, basically. So if you had flows going in the river, maybe some of that would have reached Texas and they would have less of a case, perhaps.
Well, I think the state just has to reconceive how it is operating its rivers. The Rio Grande once had perennial flows, of course. What the state is now talking about is, well, in the 1950s, we built this low-flow conveyance channel. So when flows in the river were so low, you take the water out of the river and send it in this channel down to Elephant Butte. And unfortunately, the state engineer and the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District are once again saying we should revive the use of the low-flow conveyance channel, get some bulldozers, clear it out, put water in it. It actually has the effect of draining the river because of where it sits. And in my opinion, we need to restore the river as the channel that delivers water. And, again, think of all the wonderful benefits in terms of wildlife and a living river that are below Santa Casia Dam. But that's not the current thinking in our water management agencies. And it is about Texas v. New Mexico.
Boy, when you're young, you just expect when you go to a river, there's going to be water. And I remember living in Albuquerque, 20, 30 years ago, whenever it was. I was too young. It's so long ago, I can't remember. But I remember that's about when the things started drying out.
Yeah.
And we would go to look at it because there wasn't any water.
Yes.
And it was so bizarre.
Yes. It was Mark Twain who said it's amazing what water will do for a river. It wasn't when he saw the Rio Grande, right? At least that's the story. And in Senator Domenici's time, with whom we fought over flows basically for the Silvery Minnow, and that was when people were driving their cars in the Rio Grande then.
Yep. Those cases, I was city editor at the New Mexican, and Keith Easthouse was my environmental reporter, and those were incredible times because the idea that you keep enough water to keep the creatures that were there before us alive doesn't seem that big of a stretch.
No, and again, it was federal law, and it was not, and we now have a really good program, a lot of cooperation from the state and from the Conservancy District, but all due to federal law and due to an environmental group that brought a lawsuit and kept on it with a lawsuit, and members of our delegation like Senator Bingaman at the time who supported efforts to keep water in the river.
Yeah. And on that note, we'll take a quick break and be back in a moment with another segment of Conversations Different.
Are you searching for a space of your own that's unique, but feel like you may never find it? HomeWise is here to help. Our El Camino Crossing mixed-use community is in the heart of Santa Fe, with easy access to walking and biking trails, and close to restaurants, breweries, and entertainment venues in the rapidly revitalizing Siler and Agua Fria corridor. Check out our innovative live-work units with energy-efficient features and 2 levels that can be configured for live-work, all-live, or all-work. Contact us today to learn more about how you can create your own space at El Camino Crossing. Call 505-983-9473 or visit us at homewise.org. Equal Housing Lender, NMLS number 188231.
We are back with Denise Fort talking about water, which, what is the Western saying? Whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting.
Yes.
And that's what we do in New Mexico. One of the things we talked just a bit about the Texas v. New Mexico Supreme Court case, which if Texas wins, as many expects, then we're going to have to worry a lot more about how much water gets to the border and whether the people who are pumping can keep pumping as much as they're pumping, because Texas has claimed the overpumping of water in that area, which is a rich agricultural area, affects them.
Yes.
And how do we, do we give them a bunch of money and they go away, or do we give them more water? How do we settle that? I know it depends on the court's decision, but what's typical?
Well, again, another story I remember with Bill Hume, Governor Richardson's advisor, and when Texas was suing us over the Pecos, and they said, we'll take money instead of water. And we said, no, we don't trade money for water. And you're going, well, why not? But I think in this instance, there is a consent decree, although it hasn't been agreed to by all parties, the federal agencies and the Elephant Butte Irrigation District. It is the case that we're going to have to do some things about water use in the lower Rio Grande, but also likely in the middle Rio Grande. And I think from thinking about what the state is undergoing now in terms of, we call it aridification, not drought. It feels like drought, but with drought, you think, well, it's going to end and things are going to go back to so-called normal. And we're not going to return to normal. The averages are different. Again, 25 to 30% decrease in flows in the next several decades. But in some years, it can and will be worse than that in terms of flows. And so I think we're going to have to change agricultural use of water within the state. And I think, now the notion is the state is putting tens of millions of dollars. The federal government put $4 billion into the Colorado River to pay irrigators to not irrigate some years and then return to irrigation. The smarter thing to do probably is to rethink the areas that are irrigated and those aren't, and to do so-called land repurposing, which has been done now in California, in which communities get together and they say, here are the areas that remain irrigated, here are the ones that don't. What land use happens then on the lands that are taken out of irrigation? First you have to pay the person whose water it was and whose land use. You hope you can find other land uses, which we hope would be renewable energy, but we don't know. There might be other land uses. What we don't want is dust. Right. I worry about dust, and I wasn't even alive during the Dust Bowl, but New Mexico certainly was. And
I lived in West Texas, which has its own Dust Bowl every spring, whether whether it's a drought or not.
Yeah. So we don't have enough water to keep irrigating. We just don't. And, that's where our water is going. But I don't think it makes fiscal sense to just do it on a year-by-year basis. And it hasn't, and a long way of answering your question, that's what they're attempting to do on the lower Rio Grande, and they're attempting to do in the middle Rio Grande. But it hasn't been terrifically effective.
And obviously, you don't want to get into the idea of, the government planning, like the Soviet Union with the agriculture planning of the crops. But you do want to have maybe a community-based plan to say, here's what we're going to do in the future so we can all make a living and not give up our way of life. And I know at the community college, they teach hydroponics and aquaponics, which is a way to use water more efficiently, grow lots of food. It's energy, it uses a lot of energy.
Yes.
But it doesn't use nearly as much water, and you can get more food because you can grow year round when you do things like that. So I don't know if that's an alternative for people who want to keep farming or not.
Well, it's so weird now that we are maybe the 7th largest dairy producing state, and you go, why? Well, maybe originally because we didn't do much about restricting use of groundwater. But our water is largely going to alfalfa, and that water is largely going to these enormous dairy operations, and then the dairy products are shipped out of state. So we're not getting local food, unlike the projects you mentioned at the community college. Alfalfa, it takes a lot less by way of people working. And again, in contrast to what you've mentioned, the community college, so it's a much less expensive crop for farmers to do. And so it's a really big transition for the state. And no, we don't want to emulate, Stalin in thinking about how this is done. And that's what these California districts, same issues there, where they had to cut back on groundwater. It has to be community-led, and it's going to be painful, but the state has to acknowledge, and turning to the 50-year water plan, the state has to acknowledge that we can't keep reaching out for new supply projects, and yet we're still pretty
Right.
much
I
thinking
mean, you
about
want to
that.
have water rights and you want to have water,
Yeah.
but you also have to use what you have differently.
Yeah.
And what is it? 75% of the water in New Mexico is used by agriculture.
Yes.
But not to grow food that humans eat necessarily, but to grow crops that animals eat that may or may not even be good for us in some cases.
Yeah, it's a very, I think sometimes the estimate's about 2% of the food we consume in New Mexico is grown in New Mexico, and most of what we are growing is shipped out of state, and the question of what kind of agriculture should we be doing in a desert state, and so the questions for the acequias are somewhat different because they don't have water storage as much, so they're in some ways directly affected by climate, but it's also more likely if we go buy something at the farmer's market that it was grown at an acequia. For the pueblos and tribes, they have these prior and paramount water rights, so their water will be the last to go under the changed climate.
Which is why they had to do water settlements like the Amat and the Abetha settlement up in Taos, because if you didn't settle at any moment almost, you could have your water taken away from you, which people did not understand. I still don't. You cannot explain that to the people who are supposed to be hooking up to the system now.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a future that it's hard in the east. Well, on the coastal areas, they use the term manage retreat, which is a very kind of sad and negative idea, but it is, in response to climate, we're going to have to manage things in a way we haven't managed them. And I think agricultural lands and the ones that are, that really shouldn't be in agriculture are going to be the ones that are reduced. The ones in the bosque areas along acequias and so on have multiple benefits. They have benefits for wildlife and they can be managed in a different way. But there's some areas that, the water, it just doesn't make sense any longer. Hard thing for the legislators to get. And I was thinking that, we might touch on the governor coming up with her strategic water supply, which is different from the strategic water reserve, which is used for in-stream flows. But, the idea that we'd get a $500 million subsidy for, quote, new water. And it's like, New Mexico, we got to live with the water we have. There are all sorts of issues about subsidizing water and these types of water in particular, but we haven't turned that corner yet.
All right, and we'll take a break and be back in a moment with more Conversations Different.
Thanks, Inez. This is Patrick Dorsey, publisher of the Santa Fe New Mexican. We hope you're enjoying this episode of Conversations Different with Inez Russell Gomez. Great local content is only possible with a talented staff dedicated to bringing you the best local content possible. For that staff to do its work, we need your support by subscribing to the Santa Fe New Mexican. If you're already a subscriber, thank you. And if not, there's never been a better time to subscribe. In addition to our home-delivered newspaper that comes with full digital access, we also provide digital-only subscriptions for SantaFeNewMexican.com. We'll also be releasing more online-only audio and video programming moving forward. The Santa Fe New Mexican has been here for nearly 175 years, and we want to continue being your source for local news and information. Visit us at SantaFeNewMexican.com/subscribe or call us at 505-986-3010. Thank you.
We are back with Conversations Different with a refreshing topic of water. And Denise Fort, who is spending a lot of her time these days working on ways that New Mexico can improve how it uses its water, whether in our rivers, our ground supply. And obviously, water has been in the news. The Colorado Compact reached 100 years just a couple of years ago. I always like to say that it was signed at the Palace of the Governors in 1922. The new version is a little different because the lower compact states have said, yes, we are going to use less water, which is a huge change. Tribal nations and their rights to water have been discussed and included, and there's some settlement about ready to be reached with that. And New Mexico is one of the states that just uses water from the river as opposed to storing it like they do in Arizona and Nevada. So that's what you were talking about in the previous segment. Those are places where they're getting people to not grow anymore or to use the land differently. At what point do we get there in New Mexico on a larger scale?
There are concerns with the Colorado River, just again because of climate change in the Colorado River, and concerns for New Mexico because Santa Fe and Albuquerque, we are using imported water from another basin, and I think just to think about that, to be in a place where your water comes from somewhere else. That might just make one slightly uncomfortable. Well, and then you've got the Colorado River Basin is very much having to tighten up on available water. And then our San Juan Chama water was negotiated later than the compact and would be water that would be even more vulnerable to potentially to Colorado's demands. I think when we're talking about all the sayings that are used for water, the other one is water flows uphill to money. And so, I think we would assume at the end of the day that the cities, that Albuquerque and Santa Fe, will get our San Juan Chama allocations, but we have to wonder. I was on the Buckman board for a number of years, and one of the concerns is that you've got to have so-called carriage water to bring our San Juan Chama water down to us. And if Albuquerque cuts off its use of water, if the irrigators are cut off, again, because there's not enough water, then we, who depend on the San Juan Chama water, might not have it available at a given time. And that hasn't happened yet, but again, just because when we rely on averages, there can be some years that are very bad years. And at that point, relying on our imported San Juan Chama water might not make us feel as fat and happy as we do now.
Right, because that's one of the things people in Santa Fe always say. We have the wells, we have San Juan Chama, and we are in, what's the other one?
We have the river.
And then we have the river, and we have rain and the reservoirs, et cetera. Yeah. So we have more sources of water, so we're just swell. But that's not necessarily true, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think here's where on each of these topics, there are people who know more than I do. And it's just hard to almost be a generalist, but I would say that what I think we need in Santa Fe is some way to bring in other voices. The Water Division settled on this notion of pumping our San Juan Chama water up to the Rio Grande, treating it, putting in the Rio Grande, and taking out twice as much San Juan Chama water. In effect, they settled on that with a contractor. The contractor put the idea out. There was never a public hearing, although they had the so-called listening sessions. We never had a hearing before the city council on it. A water engineer I know has said, well, it would be a better idea to do groundwater storage for the San Juan Chama water that we have now, that we could be sure it would be there in the future. This would be not my expertise, but we should have processes, even an environmental impact statement, you get a chance to say, what are the alternatives? What has less of an environmental effect? What are the costs? What are the alternatives that might be less expensive?
Is this long-term sustainably?
Is it sustainable? And so we've never had, with respect to this city's use of the city's going forward with putting the effluent back in the river, we've never had that kind of open discussion. And I would say with outside expertise that is not hired by the Water Division, but rather responding directly to the city council. I think we all need to understand, because your newspaper, the letters to the editor about any given day, there's some number about, is there the water for the new growth? Right. Water Division says absolutely, and then other people might be scratching their heads. Well, suppose there's a fire in the watershed. Suppose San Juan Chama water's turned off for some period of time. How much groundwater do we have, and so on?
Well, what I always think is that maybe there's not water for huge growth, but there has to be water for some growth, or the city completely stagnates and no one can afford to live here. And you have to think about, what are we not doing? Forget the return flow credits and all of the kind of really complicated technological things. Does every house have a rain barrel? Do we have catchment systems in our parks so we could water more
Yes.
efficiently. We have so many things
Yeah.
that we're not doing. I mean, we don't even have permeable sidewalks downtown so that we can recharge,
Yes.
and all that water is flowing away and things like that. So I think that, in terms of infrastructure to catch water and reuse water in Santa Fe, there's so much more we could do. And we already do a great job with low flow toilets and those kinds of things. We use less water than most cities in the country by far. And what is the thing that, like in the 80s, we had fewer people.
Yeah.
And now we use less water
Yes.
than we did.
Yes, about
then.
a third less. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think all of that is true, and I didn't mean to take a side sort of on how much more
No, I get
housing
that.
is there.
Right.
I'd also like to see water in the river and in 2 Mile Pond.
Yes. 2 Mile Pond was just like an avoidable disaster.
It's
That
still,
was
it's
so
still
silly.
drying out. Well, it's still drying out now. There, the beavers have lost the habit. I was up there the other day. It's not what you want to see. We had the
little
living
froggies
pond.
are gone.
Yeah, we had a living pond in the city, and we should have that. And so, we want and we want trees. We want to
gotta
be
have-
able to water our trees. And so, no, I guess I was trying to say more that it's kind of an institutional one. Many cities have water advisory bodies that report directly to the city council, and rather than reporting, basically planning now is such as it is goes through the water division. I think we
So you need a
expertise.
direct line,
Yes.
perhaps,
Yeah.
to talk about some
Yes.
things that could be done. That's
Yes.
that's a great idea. And I didn't mean to imply that you were speaking out on growth, but
No.
what you're saying is everybody here is concerned
Yeah.
about water.
Yeah.
And I think I also heard you say we need to plan for something not to go right.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you plan for everything to be perfect,
Yeah.
you're going to be in a mess.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the San Juan Chama water not arriving is very likely something that could go wrong, given the circumstances. And when you consider that maintenance in the city has not exactly been perfect, the operation of the wells, the Buckman diversion, the sand, all those things also could lead us to a hard place.
Yeah, I think we need ongoing full conversations about these, and it's said of water managers in general, they decide, announce, defend is their slogan. It's like, no, we have to turn that around and open it up much more from the very beginning. I think that is happening with the Interstate Stream Commission has just started a regional water planning process that gives it might be questions about what regional planning can actually change about water management, but at least they're bringing people in.
And they're
across the
going
state.
around the state
Yes, they
asking
are.
people as opposed
Yes.
to going around the state
Yeah.
saying, here's what
Yes.
we're doing. What do you
Yeah.
think? Oh,
Yeah.
we don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems to be open, so that's a great thing to see happening. And I think the Bureau of Reclamation is actually doing environmental impact statements. The BOR, by the way, will not allow the reoperation of the low flow conveyance channel without an environmental review. And so, even though we have no state law providing for environmental reviews, at least the BOR will give us something like that. And this might turn, I guess I'm maligning engineers, and this might turn to the question of whether the state engineer must be an engineer.
That's right. I was going to say that's because Mike Hammond has announced
Yes.
that he's retiring, and he's been a very respected state engineer. And I mean, we'd have to have a whole other program about why is the water under the control of an engineer.
Yes.
In New Mexico.
Yes.
And there has been talk that maybe a water attorney, maybe somebody else, an environmentalist, a biologist,
Yeah.
Who could run that, hydrologist
Yes.
perhaps? Does it have to be an engineer?
No, it doesn't have to be. I used to run a program at UNM, the Master of Water Resources Administration, and students would have their undergraduate degree in whatever they came to us, and then they'd take graduate courses around the university. And that was exactly what we were training them for, was to be able to manage water resources and to at least have sat in a law school classroom, in a biology and a geology, in an engineering one. So we have to at this point the water managers in New Mexico should no longer be just planning how to build things. We've done enough of that, and it's really about management.
So it seems to me, as we wrap up, that this is a huge topic that we've barely gotten a particle of it. But New Mexico is kind of at one of those points where a lot of different things could happen because you're going to get a new state engineer. You have the 50-year water plan that was written by the governor. We didn't even touch on produced water and the whole idea that you're going to take oil field waste and then perhaps reuse it elsewhere. We have a strategic water reserve. And what else is
strategic water supply, maybe.
Yes, maybe. So what should people who are interested in preserving this resource do to be active citizens or to educate themselves?
Well, you're talking to someone who comes from the environmental community, and a 52-year member of the Sierra Club, but there's so many really good non-governmental organizations working on water now. And I think that they're working in terms of protecting environmental qualities of water, but they're also, we're all aware that it is the lifeblood of our state. And so everyone's aware that we've got to address water management issues of every kind. So I'd say join, get active with one of the good environmental groups that's looking at water issues and work with them. We've got an upcoming we have the interim committee meeting now on water resources, and then we'll have a legislative committee where the governor will be pursuing her water supply, but pursuing other items in the 50-year water plan. So speak up and speak up in the Interstate Stream Commission planning process as well, but that may have a little less to do with the big issues.
Right. And we will put the 50-year water plan on our show page. And on that note, this has been another Conversations Different. We'll be back next week. And remember, subscribe. You can get us anywhere you get your podcasts.